Hello, everyone who might be watching this recording. It is just me here today, but I'm still going to record the lesson. I just realized I'm not sharing my screen. I am going to record the lesson regardless. So anyone following along can keep up with what we're supposed to be learning this week. So today we're actually learning um, actually week 7 agenda. I don't know why I wrote week 5 here. Understanding positioning in Webflow. So an overview of Webflow's positioning types. We'll cover Z-index and how it works, and absolute positioning, and how you can create like sticky headers, fixed backgrounds, etc. So we're covering everything related to positioning in the next 35 minutes. So I have here a new page in my Webflow project, and on the style panel, you can see if you scroll down under size, there is a section for position. Right now, we can't choose anything here because we don't have anything that we've added to our page. So let's add in, a div block. Now I've added a div block, you'll see that the position drop down is active and we can click it and it gives us a couple different options. The default is static, which just basically means actually, if you open the dropdown, it gives you a summary of what this means. So it's the default positioning and just displays an element as as it is. So normally, if you don't apply like positioning or layout styles to anything, elements will stack on top of each other accordingly on the page, vertically. And then below that, there's relative, which is similar to static, like how it says in the description there. But if I, for example, click relative, it provides me more positioning options that I can play around with, namely movement options is, I guess, the way I can describe it. So for example, let me give this an actual color so we can see it visually. If I increase this, you can see it moves to the right, and that's because I am giving the left positioning value a higher value, which means I'm moving it more to the right. That's actually something that might be a bit confusing to understand at first, that the more you increase the value on the left positioning, the more the object will move to the right. I'm trying to think of like the best way to explain it. Although the more you kind of play around with layouts, the more you essentially understand this. But basically, think of it as increase the left value is pushing the object more so to the right. It's like you're increasing the space on the left, which is pushing the object to the right. I'm probably not explaining it in the best way, but I will link to Webflow's lesson on positioning too if they have clarified this in a better way. And then likewise, if you decrease, because you can also have negative values, it moves it to the left, so in the opposite direction. So same thing with the right value. The more that I increase it, the more to the left it moves. And then in the negatives, it moves more so to the right. Same applies with top and bottom. If I um, have negative values, it pushes it up, and then positive values, it pushes it down. Same thing with the bottom. So that's relative positioning. And you can see also there are other things that appear as relative positioning. There's this thing which kind of tells you what this object is relative to. We'll see that how that comes into play in a bit. And then you also have z-index, which you can set, and we'll cover that in a bit too. So that's relative positioning. So you can use it. There's one way that I mainly use it, which I will cover in a bit, but also you can use it if you need to apply move an object around in some way that you can't with margin or padding. I would always say use margin, padding, and flex layouts to position your items as opposed to using relative positioning, because it's more dynamic that way and also more responsive when you get to smaller screen sizes. However, there are definitely unique cases where using relative positioning to move or adjust an element makes more sense and works. Hard to explain what those instances are because they really just come um, into play as you build different things in Webflow. But the next positioning type we have is absolute. This basically, let me use the summary they provided, positions an element relative to its closest position parent or defaults to the body element. So the best way to really think of absolute is that, like I mentioned, with static or relative, elements stack on top of each other vertically, so one after the another. But sometimes you have unique layouts where you need something to be on top of an element. And unlike in Figma or maybe other design tools, you can't just drag that element to be on top of another element and have it work. You need to do it in a way that is kind of like coding, and the way that works is using absolute positioning. So let's actually see how that plays into part. So let's say we have this box here, and we'll give it an actual size as well, 10. And let's say this box was in a bigger box that is the full height, oops, full height and width on my page. So 100 VW, which is like viewport width. So it takes the full width of the, viewport, the user screen, and then 100% of the user's screen's height. And then, so this is our parent layer called div block 2. And div block 2 is static. And our div block, our original one, I'll actually call this the absolute block to make it clear, is absolute. So now you can see absolute is in div block 2, but it's still on the top corner of the page. We want it to be centered. So we want this element to be in the center of our screen in some way. And obviously, one of the easiest ways you can do this is you don't have to use absolute positioning. You can just make this relative and give this flex and have it work that way, which was fine. Like, let's say we did that right now. I can make this relative and I can give this flex and have it in the middle, and it'll be in the middle. That's, not a problem at all. The only time it becomes a problem is if you have two elements that are in this div block and you still need them to be stacked on top of each other. I hope I'm explaining this in the best way, but there are just certain key scenarios where you cannot use flex or any of the default layouts to stack things on top of each other. You need to use absolute positioning, because absolute positioning essentially forces an element to be exactly where you want it to be, regardless of the other elements on the page. That's the best way to think about it. It allows you to position an element exactly where you need it to be, regardless of anything else that is around it. So let's say we imagine that there was a bigger, see, once I've added this, you can even immediately see it's now starts stacking. In this case, it's actually stacking horizontally because my flex alignment is horizontal. If I made it vertical, they'd be stacking vertically. But let's say I had this green block, right? And this green block is 100% viewport width, and maybe the height is like that. And this is actually supposed to be, let me actually give it a green color. It's supposed to be behind the square, right? Now I can't really put this block in here because then it just wouldn't work. But I still need this green block to be behind my square. So I'm going to leave the green block as it is, but I'm going to select the absolute block and I'm going to make it absolute again. And you can automatically see it'll now be in the center. Now, why is it in the center as opposed to the top corner like it was before? That's because our lovely div block here, um, actually, yes, our lovely div block here is aligned in the center. And so our absolute block takes into account that we have center aligned its parent element. And so it itself will be aligned in the center. Now, like I said, absolute still means you can position this anywhere you want. So you can move it, kind of like with relative positioning, wherever. Oops, I don't know why my laptop is doing that, wherever you want. But this is just to kind of give additional context that you can use absolute positioning alongside flex to get your elements to appear where you want them to appear. But the reason we use absolute here is because we want it to be on top of the green div behind it. And so in order to get that to happen, we have to make at least one. We could also make this absolute instead and this relative. It doesn't matter which one. But in this case, we made the black box absolute, so it would be on top of the green. So it's as if this green, like whether we remove it or not, it doesn't affect this black square in any way because we're using absolute positioning for the black square. The other thing you want to be careful with absolute positioning is that it will always be in relation to its parent layer that has a positioning of relative. Now, in this case, you can't really see the ramifications of that because, for example, if I click its parent layer, the position is actually static, but you want to make sure that it's the parent layer of whatever your absolute block is in is set to relative. In the future, when you have a section with, and I'll see if I have time to actually build out something to illustrate some of these things we're learning, but when you have a lot of different sections and elements, the absolute element, so the element that you have applied absolute positioning to, will always be relative to whatever parent layer is set to relative positioning. And so you have to make sure that the parent layer that is controlling this block, whether that's the immediate parent layer or maybe the secondary, tertiary parent layer, has to have position relative in order to make sure that your section works. It's hard to explain, but it's easier to understand when it comes to execution. But the key thing to remember is if you're using absolute position for absolute positioning for an element, make sure its parent layer or one of its parent layers, because it doesn't have to be the immediate one, but make sure one of the immediate parent layers is set to position relative. And when you click the absolute block, you can actually see it says now it is relative to div block 2, which is the parent layer. Do not allow it to be relative to the body because, like I said, once you're building more complex layouts later on, you'll see that it isn't behaving in the way that you want it to. So that's absolute positioning. The other positioning we have is fixed and sticky, which are pretty similar. So if we read the summary, fixed positions an element relative to the browser window. So it stays in place as the page is scrolled, and sticky fixes an element to the canvas only after a user scrolls past a specific location on the page. Yes. I said yes. So the easiest way to actually really understand any of these things is to, in fact, um, actually play around with them. So if I open up, yeah, let me open up this, right? So we built this beautiful, beautiful um, thing last week, and I'm going to use it as a visual reference for explaining some of these layouts. So right now, let's say we wanted to make our navigation fix. Currently, if I go into preview and scroll, the navigation does not scroll as we scroll, but we want to make our navigation scroll as we scroll. This is a situation where you would use fixed positioning because, like it said, fixed positioning would make sure that the element stays in place as the page scrolls. So if we make this fix, for example, we can see that now as we scroll, the user scrolls. And fixed positioning, you can adjust where exactly the section is fixed. Right now, it's fixed to the top, but you can also fix it to the left or to the right or to the whole page. It's up to you. We have given our nav section specific dimensions, hence why it doesn't really matter when we're clicking a lot of things, except maybe to the bottom and move to the bottom. But we want it to be at the top. So we're going to click this. So now it's fixed to the top of the screen. Now you'll also notice that if I undo this, when we made it fixed, the section at the bottom moved up. And that's because when you have anything that's fixed, essentially it's almost like absolute in that it ignores all other sections and all other sections ignore it. So before the other sections were taking into account that there is a navigation section here that is taking space. Therefore, these sections have to come after the previous section. But now that we made it fixed, the other sections don't take into account that there's anything here because it's almost like an overlapping layer that is on top of every other layer. So the other layers behave as if there is nothing. And the layers, you can see this is before the main wrapper, but currently the main wrapper is acting like there's nothing else on the page. So it's moved everything to the top of the page, hence why the content falls underneath it. And so as you scroll, you can see that this is fixed. The other thing with fixed before we move on to sticky is you want to make sure you give it a Z index, especially for stuff like navigation or essentially anything you have fixed on the page that you want to make sure will overlap everything. So right now you can see as we scroll, it overlaps everything as intended. But as you build more complex layouts that maybe have their own Z indices, whatever the plural of that is, you might run into an issue where you're scrolling and all of a sudden there's something that overlaps the navigation. So for example, I don't know if this will work, but let's see. No, it won't work. I wanted to illustrate how exactly but maybe it won't work. So essentially, if you don't give it a Z index and you leave it to null or auto, sometimes you might end up in situations where something overlaps your fixed element when you don't want it to. So in order to avoid that, usually for navigation, because that's supposed to overlap everything, I just give it a ridiculously high number like 999, and that'll ensure that it is always going to be on top of every other layer on the page. Now, going back to Z indices, because I realized I've used it, but didn't actually clarify what it is. Z index is essentially if we allow the description to tell us higher numbers make an element sit on top, sit in front of other elements, while lower numbers force elements to sit behind others. So the higher the value, the more on top or the higher up the layer will be. The lower the value, the lower the layer will be. If I gave this a minus the index, you can see it is still there on the page because we can see, this boundary box here, but you can't see it anymore. But that's because it is behind everything. It's like not even on the page, honestly, because it's a ridiculously low Z index number. But the higher you put the value, the higher up it'll be. If you've used, I mean, I think any sort of design tool and you positioned or stacked things on top of each other, I think you'll understand how Z indices work. So that's fixed navigation, and then we have sticky. Sticky is pretty similar to fixed. You can also use it for navs. One thing you'll notice is that sticky does not essentially make the element disappear from the page, not disappear, but you can see that when we made this navigation sticky, the main wrapper now recognized, okay, there's a section before me, so I have to start after that section. So in a way, it can be useful if you don't want to break your layout by using fixed. But sticky is also good because there are other ways you can use sticky. So in the same way to fixed positioning, it fixes an element on your page. However, only until the user has scrolled past a specific location. So for example, if you use it as on your navigation or on any element that is supposed to be fixed throughout the page, then it's hard to really notice the difference between sticky and fixed. Besides the fact that fixed is almost like absolute, where it ignores everything else on the page, but sticky doesn't. It behaves, the elements behave in relation to one another. So it takes up space. However, if we were to build, for example, let me see here if I can build something really quick to demonstrate. Let's say we want this. Yeah. So let's say we want this shop button to be fixed as we scroll. And let's actually, let me remove the sticky from the nav. So let's say we want this button to be visible as we continuously scroll to this page. Right now it's stuck at the top, but we want it to be visible. How we do that is using sticky. Now you can apply sticky to this. Like let's say we give it sticky. And the other thing with sticky you have to keep in mind is that when you use sticky, you have to have a value for, usually it's the top value, but you can apply it anywhere depending on where you want the elements to stick. But in this case, we want it to stick to the top. So you have to give it a value here. And this value just essentially says, this is the amount of space I want there to be between this element and the top of the page before it sticks. So you can see here, I gave it 0, which means this is the amount of space I want between the element and the top of my screen before it sticks, in which case it's 0. So I don't want there to be any space. So as soon as it gets to the top of my page, I want it to stick and scroll. And so it sticks and scroll. And it stops here because this is the end of our page. We don't have anything else beyond that. But if we had more content below that, it would keep. Actually, let me add said content to really effectively illustrate what I'm talking about. So if we had more content, you can see it literally scrolls. Let me actually, it literally scrolls until the top of the section, the end of the section it's in, which is this hero component before it stops scrolling. So that's what sticky means. Now, if we increase this value to let's say 100, then it would add 100 pixels of space. So it would always maintain this amount of space between the top of the screen as you are scrolling. So that's how sticky works. It allows you to keep an element fixed on the screen as you are scrolling through a certain section. And so unlike fixed, as you can see, fixed ignores everything else on the screen. It behaves like absolute position items. So if you are using fixed in this context, it would be very difficult because it doesn't recognize that it's in a grid. It doesn't recognize the divots on. You can see here that it stops here. It doesn't go to the edge of the screen because it does recognize that it's in a hero component. Actually, what is the... Okay. Um, it recognizes the container that it's in, but it behaves as if there's nothing else. So that can have its own uses if you do want to place an element in a specific location. But for sections such as these, where you're just needing an element to scroll along a specific section, then using sticky scrolling is more advisable. Sticky can also be complex. Sometimes it can work, sometimes it can't. There's always a reason it doesn't work, though. That's the thing. I'm not saying sometimes it doesn't work because there's a glitch. There's always a reason sticky might not work. So sometimes it just requires a bit of playing around. You can always read up more about it to understand the specific rules. But the key ones to remember is number one, you have to set a top value. Oh, and number two, which I forgot to mention, is that sticky does not work if there is any element on your page that this button is within. So any parent layer, if it has a overflow hidden, sticky will not work. That is the key thing to remember. It doesn't matter whether it's the immediate parent layer of this element, or see here, I clicked the topmost parent layer that there is, which is page wrapper. And even if I give this parent layer overflow hidden, you can see that sticky stops working. So for the most part, that might not be an issue, but if you are using overflow hidden for other reasons, then you might have to find a workaround because sticky will not work in if any of the parent layers. It doesn't mean you can't use it anywhere else on the page. I can use it on other sections, but you can see here my button, for example, is within the hero section, and the hero section is within the page wrapper. But the hero section here is not within marquee, right? So I can give marquee, actually already has overflow hidden, and that's fine. It doesn't affect my sticky because this has no relation to what's in my hero section. My button is in this specific hero section. So if I gave anything in my hero section, for example, overflow visible, sticky would stop working. Or if I gave, a parent layer to hero section, which in this case would be main wrapper or page wrapper, overflow hidden, then sticky would stop working. So that's also another thing to keep in mind. You cannot use overflow hidden for any parent layer um, that your sticky element is in. Otherwise, it'll stop working. So we've covered all the positioning styles actually, and also talked about the Z index. The other thing I've just forgotten that we wanted to cover is, okay, so using absolute positioning, creating sticky headers, and fixed backgrounds. So to finish off, as always, the best way to really understand things is to actually build something that implements any of these lessons that we've learned is what I meant to say. So I'm going to go back to Squarespace and I'm going to see if there's anything that quite clearly uses. I think static and relative positioning are they're fairly standard. So I don't think it's necessary to do something that's, sorry, I meant to say to do something that uses those positioning. They're very straightforward, but absolute fix, I think those are the more complicated ones. So I wanted to build something that uses one or both of them to illustrate how it works. So for example, this you could say uses absolute positioning. So it has an image here and then this huge text that is overlapping the image. So most likely they've used absolute positioning for this heading. And then at the same time, you also have absolute positioning for this button here so that it can overlap the text. So there are three use cases in here, well, two use cases rather, where um, there is absolute positioning used. So yeah, let's use that. Let's use that as an example. And we can even apply fixed navigation to the nav here so we can kind of show how it would appear. Fixed or sticky can work in this case. So let's do that. So first let's actually build out this hero section first. So I'm not going to name anything because this is an ongoing project and a lot of the layer names are taken. But let's assume we have this hero section and we want it to be the full width and full height of the page. And we'll give it a background color of 2 Let's do the screen, right? Then we have this, doo-doo-doo-doo. We have this image here. So first, let me actually give this padding. I'll use percentage actually. Oops. Give it padding. And then let's add this image. So I like to add all my images or most of my images in div blocks first for mostly accessibility reasons. But in this case, let's just add an image. So I'll add an image. I don't know if we actually have any. Could I get this image? Okay, let me inspect. So I can grab this image and let me add it to Webflow. So you can see our image is there. There's padding that we've added to our parent layer, hence it doesn't get to the edge of the screen. But we do want to give it like a certain height. It's not supposed to take the full height of the container. Oops, it's not minimum height. So let's give it a height of like, I think it's like 70%. They have it here. And then to make sure that the image itself is not stretched, we'll give it a fit size of cover. They also have like this weird, actually wonder how they did the whatchamacallit. Okay, not wasting any more time. They also have this cool like curve radius they've used. It's not really a border radius. It's like a clip path, but because of time, we will use a border radius. So it's somewhat similar to what they have here. Now, next, we're gonna have our heading. So going back to our parent layer, we want to give it flex and center. Actually, want to give it flex on top because this is aligned to the top, not really aligned to the center. And we're going to add in our heading. And you can immediately see, as you might think, we'll actually set this to vertical. It comes underneath the image, but we need it to be overlapping the image. So first, I'm going to adjust the size of this heading. I'm going to make it as big as I can. Let's use this font. And then even bigger. And it's supposed to say, okay. So then I'm going to select this and I'm going to give it absolute. Normally, I wouldn't apply this to the text itself because as we've learned, default text styles are better to use. But I would give this customization to the div block this heading is in. But in this case, and I'm going to actually pin my nav so it doesn't keep disappearing. We're just going to apply it to the text itself. So you can see it's applied and it's gone to the top because we've set it here in our div block 4 to go to the top. However, we need our text to be more on the bottom. So we're actually just going to use absolute positioning and move it on the bottom manually. So I can use VW, which basically resizes the text accordingly as you reduce the size of the screen. So if I preview, for example, the bigger the size of the screen, the larger the text, the smaller the text. We'll just do that for now. So this is our text. Maybe we positioned it a bit too much and I'll decrease this. And then same with the text, maybe I'll increase the size of that. And for the color, let's we'll make it purple. So now we have our heading that is on top of our image because we've given it absolute positioning and we've pushed it 40% down. So we moved it down by 40%. Next, and the final step is to, well, almost the final step is to add our button, which is on the bottom corner here. So you can add a button and then also give it absolute positioning and then also adjust, your absolute positioning so it's on the corner. However, one thing I don't like to do a lot of the time is to use absolute positioning excessively. Because one thing, it might not always look as good as you resize your screen. So responsiveness is something to keep in mind. You might design something in a certain way and use absolute positioning and it looks good on like how it is now. And then as soon as you preview and you resize your screen, you realize, oh, actually that doesn't work. So I always wanted to try and think of what is a way you can position something first using Flex or even Grid. And then if it's still not positioned where you want it, then you can use absolute positioning. So in this case, I'm actually going to wrap this heading. I'm going to remove the absolute positioning. I'm going to wrap this heading in a div block. And I'm going to give this div block absolute positioning and the 40%. I'm then going to add in my button. It is in this div block, right? So it's in the same div block. If it was just in the general layer, you can see it would be here in the middle behind the image. But now that I put it in this div block, this and the heading are essentially in one parent container, which means if I select this button and I give it absolute positioning, it's going to be absolute positioned according to this layer here, as opposed to according to this layer, which is huge and we would require a lot more um, positioning in order to get the button to be on top of the text, which is what we want. But now that we put it in a container with the heading, you can see now it's relatively close to the heading and it doesn't require much to get it to be positioned in where we want it to be. So let's just play around with this and fix the styling a bit. Um, we can do this, we can make it yellow, and we can make the text, we can make the text purple and the font black. And what does it say? It says book a table. Okay, and that's this. And then we can like play around. You can play around with this. You don't have to use percentages either. I'm using percentages just because, but you honestly don't have to unless it is aside for this. You can use any sort of dimensions that you want. Let's make this also larger. So now when we preview, we can see we have our text here and we have our button. You can see the button almost becomes bigger than the text as we scroll down. That's because we're using viewport width for the heading to make it dynamic. Obviously, as the heading becomes smaller, so does the text. So the button then becomes bigger. So if we want to avoid that, we can use a fixed value for the heading. Like let's make it 22 rem. Obviously, that means it's going to cut off the page because it's not resizing, but that's just a matter of playing around with um, different sizing options. In this case, we're not really focusing on responsivity, rather just to show you how positioning works. So now you can see we have our image here, we have our heading here, and we have our button here. And then like always, if we wanted a fixed nav, just because I'm running out of time, you can create your navigation and then give it a fixed positioning, and then it would scroll along with the page. I think we'll stop here for today. Hopefully that was relatively informative on how positioning works. I think positioning is one of the things that might be the most complicated to understand, more so than layout, in my opinion, but maybe I'm wrong. But it's also something that becomes easier to grasp the more you practice it, and the more really the key thing is understanding how to build different layouts, because it's not until you practice how to build different layouts that you understand, okay, this is what I need to do to get things to look like this, or this is what I need to do to get things to look like that, which is why I really encourage, when you have time, you can go through Squarespace, you can go through even Webflow templates, you can go through other sites that have designs and just pick any that looks interesting to do. It can even look hard, but the real key thing here is to practice how to build these different layouts. It doesn't have to be perfect, but the more that you do it, the more you understand how Webflow works. Theory only goes so far, because theory is a lot of words that I'm saying, and the words might not make sense, but when you actually start doing the work, then you can see how it all comes together. So, ooh, let me stop sharing my screen. Um, okay, so that really wraps it up for today. Thank you to anyone who watches this. And as always, if you have more questions, let me know. The homework is going to be the same moving forward from now on, which is just practice, 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 practice building something. You can share your work by email. You can message me on WhatsApp if you want me to look at anything, or if you have further questions. Webflow also has a lot of lessons and courses and stuff that you can take a look at to better understand how some of this stuff works. If I haven't explained it well, they have. You can look at YouTube as well. But yes, if you have questions, just let me know, and hope everyone has a great weekend.